All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the seventh episode of the first season of This, That, and the Other. My name is Varun Chandramohan, your host for today. My co-host for today has over 15 years of experience in learning and development and is currently a corporate learning and development consultant and coach. Shane Ferdinandez is here with us today. Hello, Shane. Welcome to the show.
Hi everyone. Hi Larry. Hi Steve.
Hi, Sam.
Hey. All right. So This, That, and the Other, for those who are wondering, is a series that tackles some of the biggest, most controversial challenges HR and senior managers face within an organization. So far, we've covered affairs at work, side hustles while being employed, what does it take to be successful, luck or strategy, gender diversity and equality, sustainability, and last week we spoke about, is there anything called ethical marketing? This week, we'll be talking about dignity of work. Will it ever arrive here? And it's time to introduce our guest. First up, he's a specialist in financial services strategy and business development and is currently a partner at KPMG China. Larry Campbell is here with us today. Hello, Larry. Nice to have you on the show.
Lovely to be here. Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Next up, he's an international business executive with a broad background of work experience in both corporate training and field operation roles. And he's currently the Vice President Learning and Development at Etihad Airways. Andrew Brooks is here with us today. Hello, Andrew.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity.
The pleasure is ours. And finally, he's a brainchild behind the unwritten ground rules tool that helps leaders around the world to understand, manage, and strategically improve corporate culture. And he's currently the director of Keystone Management Services. Steve Simpson is here with us today. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Varun, and hi, everyone. I've really been looking forward to this, so delighted to be involved.
Oh, fantastic. And thank you for joining us, gentlemen, and welcome to the show. All right, let's dive straight in. I would like to start with asking, from a corporate perspective and from a global perspective, how would you define dignity at work? What is it? And why do organizations need to care about it? Why do we need to care about it? So Steve, could we start with you, and maybe you can define or rather give us your view of what dignity at work is?
Thanks for picking me first, Varun. I really appreciate it. Look, from my perspective, dignity at work is really quite simple. It's about respect. It's about people feeling respected, valued, and safe in the workplace. And I think there's two ways we can think about this. From a human perspective, if we think about all of our people in a workplace, every single one of those individuals has a life. They care about their family, they have their struggles. So there's a human side to dignity at work and making those people feeling valued, respected and safe. But there's also a business case for this. So in a business sense, there's a fundamental question, and that is, do we want to get the best out of our people? And I think providing dignity can help enable that. So that's it in a nutshell for me, Varun.
Oh, thanks, Steve. Andrew, Larry, who would like to take a stab at? All right.
I'm happy to go. I'm happy to go next. I mean, look, for me, it's just it's probably just as simple as treating others as you'd like to be treated yourself. You know, I just feel that I'm a great believer in karma. I'm a great believer in sort of like positive energy, and what you give, you get back. You know, so I think if you respect people and you listen to people and you engage with people, I'm a very simple chap. You know, I have very, very simple rules, and you know, I would almost distill it down to, you know, the basic 5 things, which is, and it sounds absolutely crazy, and I'm often challenged on it, and people say, you know, do you really think it's as simple as that? But I would say just the simple things like, you know, just making eye contact and smiling. Never failing to say hi to anybody. You know, that kind of piece around really listening to people, and then hoping you're going to meet them again. There's always 5 things for me, and those 5 things make a huge difference. And it's actually a lot harder than it sounds to do. Genuinely, it's a lot harder. So often, I've done numerous workshops. We have a whole strategy, a whole policy around this in Etihad. And of course, it's easy to say it, but actually doing it is actually quite exhausting. But you practice it, and you become what you practice. So I think for me, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're coming into contact with me within my kind of like, I suppose now there's almost like the perfect sort of social distancing sort of ring. I often talk about having a circle around me where I'm trying to contact people, but just treating people with respect. Not judging them on the colour of their skin or how they sound or how they look. You know, I think that's where it's at. So to answer your question very simply, it's about, you know, treat others as you wish to be treated.
Right. Oh, thanks, Andrew. Larry, what are your?
Yeah, happy to go next. I think we're pretty well aligned, the three of us today. There's a lot that you gentlemen both said that I completely gel with. For me, it's all about self-respect. I'm going to take a deeply personal view of all of this, right? It's all about self-respect. I've had the privilege of growing up in Sri Lanka, leaving that country, having worked there since I was 16 years old, and then working in multiple cultures in Europe, in the US, in China. And the only thing common in all of that, ultimately, is me. And in order for me to get the respect that I think I need to understand what I am, what respect I deserve. And it's through that lens, to build on what Andrew said, that I then look at other people. When I speak to the tea lady and speak to her the same way that I speak to the CEO of the organization, I'm speaking to the man in the mirror. And that's what I'd like to teach my children. Right? I actually have a child sitting with me off camera right now here, listening to this live with an earpiece. And I hope she's listening and hearing what I say. That's how I'd like her to to treat people when she grows up, with the same respect that she expects for herself, and that she would give her mother, her father, the person on the street. Ultimately, we're all humans, right?
Oh, that's really good. I really agree.
Oh, absolutely. So, which brings me, I'm so glad you brought up Sri Lanka. And we do have a global audience. However, bulk of our audience today are from Sri Lanka, and they're listening in. There is sometimes in our country that we notice, and sometimes in other countries, where there's a difference in the different types of jobs and how you view it. And do you think that has to do with culture, or where do you feel that whole differentiation came through? Any thoughts on that? And is there a cure to that? Yeah.
I'm going to go with experience. I'm going to go with what you experience. So I'm quite. I also have two. Well, my children are a little bit bigger. I have a 22-year-old and a 21-year-old, so they're a little bit. But they kind of moved international when they were 11. They actually have. We're obviously British. I originate from a place called Dorset, on the south coast of the UK. I spent a lot of my life working in Melbourne and in Sydney, which was very interesting for me. I suppose when I kind of first moved out of the UK and sort of the European sort of operation areas, it was. For me, I suppose the big learning for me was quite fascinating. I used to manage a lot of Australians working in the UK, and I had the highest regard for those individuals. And they were always, on their A game, sort of top 1%. When I then obviously moved to work in Australia, I kind of thought it was going to be some type of utopia. There was quite an interesting, it was obviously quite an interesting sort of like experience for me, because when I went there, I actually found that there was a complete myriad, there was a complete range of motivation and experience and who these people were. So Australians, I suppose I had this lens that I was using to view what I believed to be an Australian, and that has then sort of continued with me. So of course now, the more that I come into culture, and I've worked a lot in Egypt, I've worked all over the Middle Eastern countries, I've worked all over America and all over Russia, and when I come into contact with those individuals, I have this, I suppose, this unconscious bias, and I have to almost like track myself and think, actually, hang on a second, whoa, your position, you're taking your view, your experience, and you're naturally placing that against an individual. And I think that's a very, 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 very dangerous thing to do. So for me, I'm just mindful. I become very conscious, particularly when I'm meeting individuals, how I'm treating that person. And it goes back to what I said originally. Just treat them the same, and actually what happens then is you get a much broader kind of view of the world. And that has really translated into my children, because if I look at my children's cousins, so I have obviously nieces and nephews who haven't really left the UK, their view of someone who's maybe wearing hijab, or their view of someone's skin color, or how they sound is quite polarized. And it's actually, we find it actually quite offensive, because definitely some of the cultures that I work a lot with, if I talk to even my parents and my brothers and definitely my nieces and nephews, they have a very sort of polar view of those individuals. And it's actually, I actually do find it deeply offensive, because I said to them, you haven't experienced these cultures actually at front. You have a press kind of generated, a media generated view of those individuals, and you're aligning yourself to that. So I said to them, go and have the experience. If you've had the experience and then you still have that view, then that's fine. But go and have that experience, and it's about respecting people and treating people as you want to be treated.
Andrew, you raised some really good points, and it's really interesting, Andrew, that despite you spending some time in Australia, we weren't able to modify your accent, which I guess means
people say to me, they say to me, I sound Australian, but clearly not, Steve.
No, absolutely not. We failed dismally. But Andrew, you raised some really good points there, because what you're talking about there is the individual bias, the generalized individual bias that we can bring to any context, which I think is a really vital point. But there is another side to this, and that is the workplace culture that we enter, which can also dramatically impact on our behaviours. So we work with the concept, or I developed the concept of UGRs, unwritten ground rules, people's perceptions of this is the way we do things around here. Right. So that's the culture of an organisation, people's perceptions of this is the way we do things around here. It's the UGRs. So they can include things like, at our meetings, it isn't worth complaining because we know nothing will get done. And there are many other UGRs in organisations. So a new person to an organisation, and it doesn't matter how senior they are or junior they are, they will normally stay quieter when they are new. They'll normally stay quieter than they otherwise would. Why? Well, they're doing this unconsciously. It's not a conscious act, but they're actually checking out. They're trying to find out what the UGRs are, the unwritten ground rules are. Why? In order that they can conform. And that's the power of workplace cultures. Right. We come in, many of us have been to companies where we come in all very excited with new ideas, eager to change and help things, but that can get drummed out of us through the UGRs, and we become one of them, if you like. So there's two forces here. I think Andrew's point's a really good one. The individual experiences and generalised biases that we personally have, but also the workplace cultures or the unwritten ground rules, the UGRs, that in a sense really have a dramatic impact on shaping our behaviours.
Right. I'd like to build on something Andrew said, but before I do that, I wouldn't use culture as the excuse to point towards bad behavior. I'd use another C word, and that's actually conditioning. Conditioning, right? And that starts again at a very personal level. That starts right the moment you're born. That starts with your family unit. That starts then with the wider social unit or units that you grow up with. It starts with the school you go to, the religious groups that you participate within, right? And that all gives you a conscious as well as unconscious bias about yourself and those people around you. I grew up in a family environment where it was perfectly acceptable. In fact, it was absolutely okay for my grandmother to use a word to describe people of African American descent that would get me sued, if not shot today. Right? And it wasn't 20 years ago when I had to stop my mother from using that same word. Wow. But what gave me the right to be critical of her or of my grandmother? Right? That was the society in which they grew up, and it was perfectly acceptable. Right? It was also about knowledge. It was about exposure. Again, this is the point that Andrew was also making, right? You have to expose yourself to other societies, and to build on your UGR concept, Steve, if you are in a position to get outside of your box and outside of your comfort zone, I do believe you're right. It's natural for you to be quiet, use your 2 ears rather than your one mouth first, and listen to what's going on around you. If you're smart, if you've got half a brain, and understand how to get by. If my grandmother never left the unit that she was within, that was perfectly normal, and that was the knowledge base that she had. Right. So equally, as much as I can be offended by that, I also don't think I have the right to criticize. Right? The whole thing about dignity here is about being open-minded, and that's a two-way street. So I think we need to bear that in mind as well.
It's quite. I've been doing a lot of recently I mentioned earlier I do a bit of executive coaching, and I do it internally, which is a bit of a challenge really within the organisation and at a very senior level. And one of the things that I've been drawn into recently, it's actually been causing me quite a lot of personal distress, is kind of people's values. So you're listening to people, they have a very sort of fixed set of values, and there's a couple of things really that kind of like strike me. It goes right, it kind of goes right and left. So you either have, the individual you're coaching has such values that are absolutely abhorrent, and you're kind of compromised there because you're listening, and I have a very strong sort of coaching training and the way that I go about listening to people, and I don't want to obviously try to change those values. And it's when you're listening to them, sharing their values with you during those conversations, I do feel very, very, very compromised. And also there's the other side of that kind of piece where they believe that they have to modify their personal values, which are, I suppose, in my view, as a coach, quite strong. But then, they're sort of suggesting that they would need to lose those values, or perhaps, to use this topic really about dignity, change that and actually go away from respecting other people because they want to achieve their bigger goal. And that's actually a concern as well. So I'd be very, very curious to hear kind of what Larry and Steve particularly got to say about that, where you're in those conversations and you're being, you feel you're being quite, your own personal values are being challenged, but you're very disappointed with what's being discussed by the person you're coaching.
That's super interesting, Steve.
Well, yeah, you want to throw me the hard questions. Thanks very much, Varun.
All right, then Larry it is.
I understand what's happening here.
More
This
than
is
happy to jump in.
payback on me, right? Look, what you raise, Larry, and what you raise, Andrew, are really good points, because we're talking about, so what do we do in a context where one person's values is or perspective or life experience is very different to mine. And that's where, for all the talk about the need to get workplace cultures right, for all the talk about dignity, for all the talk about stuff that's behind you, Larry, your values at KPMG, for all that talk, there is a lot of hard work that needs to go into this. And that hard work includes and must involve having difficult conversations where we're sharing our views about, for example, what does excellence, I'm looking at the value at behind Larry's shoulder. Excellence to you might mean something very different to excellence at me. Dignity for you might mean something very different to me. So I think one-on-one and one-on smaller groups and continuously, we've got to have these conversations, at the very least, to understand that we do have different perspectives on this and to start to understand where other people are coming from. Now, that's difficult because the operations of normal daily work have to happen, and this can often be seen as a very soft issue. But there's so much power in tapping into the engagement of our people, and I think we've got to have those conversations to get people engaged.
That's a really good point, Steve. I'm going to again build on that. I think values, as described through an organizational context, are what leadership of organizations decide that the broader population of that organization believe in. The difference between now versus 10 years ago, 20 years ago, certainly 30, 40 years ago, is we have actually the tools available to canvass the views of organizations formed up of hundreds of thousands of people, such that when KPMG puts those values up that you see behind my shoulder, it does represent a consultation with the totality of the firms around the world. That doesn't mean that all organizations do that. Quite often, and I'm sure you can point to as many as I can, where those values are just words that have been come up with by a PR agency to expound the position the organization or its leadership want to take. And again, when we go in to work in an organization, then we get to understand truly the construct of that organization. And the organization is an unfeeling, unliving thing. It's a limited liability company. It's a partnership. It's a piece of paper, an identity on a piece of paper. What it really is the sum totality of the personalities that make it what it is, right? And that's what that culture is. When we spend months, years in there, we start to understand whether we truly fit in or not, right? And I think that's partly the difference about whether you walk away or you decide to stay on. And you can stay on because you fit in, or you can stay on because you think you can change it, have an impact on it, drive it in a different direction. And that, I think, motivates a great many CEOs to come in to change organizations that are in dire need of change, right? So I think it means a great many different things. So therefore, for me, again, I always bring it back to that very personal thing, right? So in that context of coaching, Andrew, if I've taken on a commitment to coach someone, and in that process I realize that individual has a different value set from mine,
right.
Now, you've still got to go through that journey of understanding ultimately who's right? And if you don't decide that it's worth carrying on with, you do have the right to walk away. If you disagree with someone's values, you don't actually have to elect them president, right?
Sure.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, we contract and stuff. Yeah, it's a very good point. It was interesting because we're in a I suppose one of the big battlegrounds for me is this, and it's amazing. It completely staggers me. But this piece around subjectivity and objectivity. So I was listening to Steve, obviously talking about your values at KPMG a couple of moments ago, and it's the way that we interpret things. And I think that's a major issue right across, definitely in my organisation. The way that people interpret what is good and what is not good, and trying to put some clarity around that. I would say it's really difficult to actually. People can't even understand the difference between fact and opinion. And I think that just staggers me every single day. I mean, I genuinely, even at a very senior level, people really struggle to explain to me the difference between what is fact and what's an opinion, what's a view. And we're not saying that an opinion is a bad thing, but we've got to be very mindful that can obviously offend a lot of people if we have a particular opinion on something. So it's yeah, it's definitely as I said, for me, it's been a particular challenge over the last few months, and it's an ongoing one. But I think you're right, Larry. I came to the organisation trying to, actually that's the wrong word. I don't try and do anything. But I came to the organisation to change the way that it operates, the way that it kind of measures. The Middle East it's a very ambiguous place. And that's I suppose maybe most organisations, most cultures are ambiguous, but it's kind of weird where you get to a very senior level and we're trying to take it down those very there's a lot of talk about meritocracy and the way that we treat everyone equally and fairly within the organisation. When you go down that route, definitely for me, when I've been going down that route, we then say, okay, so we want to have meritocracy, we want to have very strong, clear ideas about what people know, do and be, how they're supposed to function within the organisation. It's been actually quite fascinating for me that people then want to almost like sow in the seed of ambiguity and of confusion to allow them to keep their own opinions. I'd be really fascinated actually to hear, guys, what you think about that. This deliberately sowing of subjectivity into the way that we measure people.
It's quite a human thing to do, isn't it, Andrew, really? Yeah. And we see it done on a daily basis by leaders around the world, particularly in this rather stressed time. And I think a point I'd make here is we tend to think that culture, and I'll touch on this from a commercial organizational perspective for a moment, right, particularly with global organizations, we tend to think that global organizations have single cultures. And I think that's an absolute fallacy, especially global organizations, because they are made up of subcultures that can be divided, geographically across as many points of presence around the world as they have employees from, right? An organization that might be 100 years old would have acquired mostly, 3 or 4 other companies along the way. Which cultures now lead them? Which ones are going to dominance? Which ones fade off? In the geopolitical sense, right? The world's powers, as they ebb and flow, influence an organization's culture and the cultures of people who participate in organizational growth. So I don't think, I'm far too old and cynical now to think there is such a thing as a single organizational culture, particularly in large global and older organizations. Right, individuals form those organizations, and again, if they come into that workplace with the self-respect that I think they should all come into a workplace with, and deserving of self-respect and prepared to give it, organizations can be better or worse for it, right? But to blame culture for the way people or groups of people behave, I think, is a bit of a red herring.
So,
Go on, Steve.
so I was working with a group of leaders and stumbled across this question, which I think is a really good question, and that's immodest. I'm sorry for framing it that way, but I think this is a good question. I said to these leaders, if I went to your people and they are being completely candid and open and honest with me, and you're not in the room as the leaders, and I asked them this question, how would they answer the question? So you're not in the room, leaders, but I'm asking your people this question. What are your leaders' top 3 priorities? Now, there was a long pause, and one of the leaders finally spoke up and said, Steve, we don't even know what our top 3 priorities are, so how would they? So what's my point? Yeah. My point is that people will deduce what the priorities of leaders are. They will deduce them, whether you've got them or not, they will deduce them. And for the purpose of our conversation today, I think I would put to you that unless culture or people or values or some synonym of those words is in the top 3 priorities of, or is perceived to be in the top 3 priorities of leaders, then we're merely talking. And I think you're dead right, Larry. I think it's ridiculous to think that we can have identical cultures in 2 different teams, let alone globally. However, I would say this, if culture is a top 3 priority, or people or values, whatever synonym of that word, if that's a top 3 priority, then I think it's fair to argue that those values that we're fighting for ought to be non-negotiable. And we don't care where you work, and to a degree we don't care what interpretation you place on it to recognise cultural differences. But those things are not negotiable. Plenty of things are, but fighting for this isn't. Now, I think unless those 2 things are in place, it's all talk. And we can talk dignity all you like, it doesn't matter. So I'll just make one final point. I'll give you an example of how people can deduce what's most important. And this is a scenario which isn't atypical. This is a common scenario. Let's just presume you have a value of teamwork. Let's just presume that, it's not uncommon. And that's part of it, dignity, focusing on dignity, teamwork. What happens in a scenario where one person, one employee, is disrespectful, nasty, arrogant and rude to all of his colleagues, and yet he's the top performer in sales? What happens? Now, in the vast majority of cases, that behaviour is tolerated. And there are UGRs that are caused from that behaviour being tolerated. That is, and so, for example, it could mean around here, this teamwork starts all a load of rubbish. It's all about performance. And that's a correct UGR to deduce if that behaviour is tolerated. So my final point here is, I think what's tolerated is in large part dictates the culture and what's accepted and the extent to which dignity is taken seriously.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with you. I mean, I think, you know, I as you're speaking, I'm just thinking about, you know, the sort of the saying, the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. So if you have a very, very autocratic, focused on, you know, getting a result, and the way that they treat people is completely abhorrent, what you're gonna tend to see, and I've seen it not you know, in multiple organisations that I've worked with, it's the same thing. So people are thinking, right, that is the leader, you know, she acts in a certain way or he acts in a certain way, and I'm going to then obviously mirror that behaviour, and of course, because that's going to get me to where I want to get to. And of course, then people, yeah, exactly right. I mean, this whole piece around URGs, Steve, it's spot on. So people they just mimic that behaviour. I'm you know, as a father, I'm very, very mindful that I've kind of produced two mini me's, really. It's a bit, I think it's a bit scary, if I'm brutally honest. But I'm very clear about that. I mean, both of my children, I coach them to death. I mean, I really do coach them to death, because I don't like to make decisions for them. You know, so I'm really hate it, and I know from working that if I make decisions for people, basically they sort of shut down, and it's back to Larry's point, they're able to blame, you know, they're able to blame me or blame the culture. So you know, for me, it's very much around whatever they're doing, is trying to be a role model for them, trying to, like, you know, trying to do the things that I believe in, what are my values, but really allowing them to make their own decisions about how we get things done. I think that's critical.
But Andrew, you're conscious about that, right? That's a conscious act. Am I right?
Oh, it's an absolute. I mean, and sometimes I have to really. It's definitely a conscious act, 100%, and I have to really think about it, because, you know, I would say 9 out of 10 times it would be much easier at work and at home. You know, 9 out of 10 times it would be much easier just to give them the answer. Because actually, when I have to step back and really kind of think about it and encourage them to share their view and to listen to what they think is happening and to see their view of the world, that takes a lot more time and it's a lot more energy intensive, you know, rather than just saying, just go and do this. But what I know is that if I take that approach, which is a slightly more energetic, it obviously burns a lot more energy and a lot more time for me, the long term is much stronger children. You know, much stronger employees. And I think that's so critical. I'm staggered. I mean, both of my children have graduated university this year, and we're obviously in the middle of this crisis, and both of my children literally walked straight out of university, straight into employment. Their peer group, they're the only two children. I keep calling them children, but they're the only two. You know, they're always going to be my children, I suppose. But they're the only two children, in my knowledge, that just walked straight out of university. All of their peers are not working, can't find work, and that's not because they haven't been applying for jobs. And I'm not being a boastful dad here. I just think it's because what we've kind of grown and developed in them is this kind of this very sort of self-sufficient, very open-minded, with these very, you know, experience-rich, open-minded human beings who treat people with respect. And I think that comes across when they're interacting with other people, so it makes them very employable. I think I'm not trying to be boastful. I genuinely am not. It's just very interesting. It's an interesting outcome from from our endeavours.
I'm fascinated by the way you think, Andrew, because it mirrors a great deal how I reflect on myself as well. But an observation just to throw out there for you guys to comment on as well. I think 2020 is an interesting year. It's one that's debunking the way a great many of us think of ourselves, think of our children, think of what success is measured by, how societies hang together, how organizations cope. This is going to be a year, thanks to COVID-19, that I think will change how many of us experts also, right, look at how people hang together as groups and even survive as individuals, right? So, you know, you talked about kids going to university, coming out, in your case, to young adults who are very successful and gone straight into employment, and the only, I think you said, pair amongst their peers to get employment. And at the same time, we're now seeing the whole notion of universities thrown up in the air in terms of how, you know, studying happens. We're seeing the German concept of apprenticeships finally being accepted again as something that might bear fruit for the future, right? How does that then affect the culture that comes after us? Because I've just heard you do this. I do it myself all the time, right? We measure success in the people we leave behind us, not just in ourselves. And
It's our legacy.
What is this business of dignity going to look like in a post-COVID world? I think it's worth reflecting on that for a moment, don't you?
I think the world's is completely changed. And the other thing I think as well with COVID is that every single person now has a cast iron excuse. It was actually quite fascinating. I was with my boss on Thursday, on Wednesday, because it was Eid, start of Eid on Thursday, but on Wednesday. And we were discussing my absolute refusal to make excuses. So I categorically will not make excuses, because unfortunately there's, you know, a lot of people I work with, a lot of people that I come into contact with, they just lie down. and they kind of go, oh, I'm going to give up now because of COVID and because of everything else that's going on. I can't find a job. But you know, that's just playing to it just allows them to kind of get off the hook, really. I think human beings like that, and that's back to the same thing we're discussing around this sort of dignity at work. It's just well, that's just how it is, Andrew. You know, but that's how we treat this nationality. This is how we treat. I mean, I'm a Chelsea fan. Yeah, I'm a huge Chelsea fan. So I know it sounds a little bit trivial, but it was a big game for Chelsea today. But we're against Arsenal, so you know, I'm very consciously judging Arsenal fans, right? And I very deliberately don't particularly like those people because they don't like us, and it's kind of like a tribal thing here. But I was kind of like half picking it up from Steve earlier when he was mocking me for being a pom, you know, and not being able to be converted, you know. So there's a bit of it's kind of weird. It's a fine line between a bit of fun, a bit of banter between kind of Arsenal fans and Chelsea fans, and you know, Australians and Brits. But there's also that kind of very serious piece around actually, you know, respecting each other. You know, I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on that, guys.
Well, I think you're raising a really good point there, Andrew, and it relates to humour in the workplace. I mean, that's what you're talking about, humour in the workplace. And, you know, humour can be nasty. Humour can be at the expense of people who aren't in the room, or it can be really genuinely nasty. But again, I think this is where the difficult conversations have got to happen. That it's okay to have our jokes and our fun and our laughs, and that's good, and we want that. But we also got to be conscious, and that's partly why I asked you, Andrew, and I'd like to know whether you're the same, Larry, whether this was a conscious act, the way that you are raising your sons, right? And indeed working with your work colleagues. Is it a conscious act, your behaviours, what you choose to do, what you choose not to do? But it involves difficult conversations where on occasions, it needs to get to a point where somebody is either in a Zoom meeting or pre-COVID in a room and and that's why I use the words, what is dignity? Safe, people feeling safe, valued and respected. If we can tick off each of those three, then somebody at a meeting or in a Zoom meeting or face-to-face will say, guys, I've just got a bit of a concern, and it relates to the humour that I'm observing. Now, I might have this wrong, but I'm just little bit concerned that it might be just going over the line a bit and being at the expense of people who aren't in the room. I might be wrong in raising this, but I just wanted to flag this as a potential issue. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that I think we've got to have sufficient safety, respect, and people feeling valued where they can raise their perceptions of potential discomfort. And that includes stuff like humour, you know. And I've heard women say, for example, there's a bit of a boys' club happening in this room through the humour between the men. You know, and the men have got to listen to that and really become conscious of their own behaviours and what they're saying and not saying, you know. So there's a really tough edge to this. This is not soft, flowery stuff. There's a really tough edge that maybe also requires some skills to be able to share feedback in ways that aren't too confronting for other people. You know, Larry, for you, is it a conscious act of the type that Andrew was talking about?
Yeah, it is, absolutely, categorically. And it's not just a conscious act in terms of how I influence my kids. It's also a reflection on how my own attitudes have evolved, right? So this is my fourth career. Right? I started off life as a journalist, became a .com entrepreneur, then a banker for a very long time, and now I'm a consultant. And those are, you know, very different careers, and I've had, the privilege of working with large groups of people, small groups of people. What I think this whole COVID business made me realize is under what circumstances would I have been happy to have my 18-year-old daughter sit on the same video conference call as me, listening into me speak and running a meeting or participating in one, versus the circumstances under which I would never let her in the room, because on reflection I would have been ashamed of what was happening in that meeting, or embarrassed, or even of my own behavior. And if I think back to how I might have acted, you know, 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago in a particular culture, right? At that point in time, with that group of people, it was perfectly acceptable. It was okay, and I might think I shouldn't apologize for it. But the question is, would I have my daughter sit in and listen to me? Maybe not, right?
Wow.
And you learn from all of that, right? And then you adapt. You also understand, again, going back to my earlier point about the way cultures work in particular geographies, the way an American culture expects you to behave is very different than the way a Chinese culture expects you to behave versus a Japanese versus a Korean versus a Sri Lankan and so on, right? Or a Hong Kong one in the context of where they see themselves on the journey of wealth that their Chinese compatriots are now making, from communism and paddy fields to being the world's richest nation. I think the last few months of being locked down, working from home, and sort of saying, yeah, okay, they can hear me, they can see me. Am I okay with that? It has been quite eye-opening. And the fact that I have been okay with that, actually, I think, has made me reasonably comfortable with myself. But it is a conscious act, right? And it does require you to step back sometimes. Look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, have I learned anything from the journey that I've been on? Therefore, if I'm only halfway through that journey, can I accept that the rest of it is going to be a massive learning curve as well? It doesn't stop.
Sure. And gentlemen, yeah, and this is fantastic. This is an amazing conversation. I just have to interrupt for just a few seconds because we have a few audience questions that are coming in, and
do we have people listening in on this conversation?
We do.
Wait, people are listening to us.
We do, and we owe it to them, and so we're going to throw these questions. I think we have about 15 to 20 minutes or so. So let's try and get as many questions as we can answered by this panel, and fantastic discussion. And next time we're going to have a 2-hour, conversation. This is beautiful. So Shane, what do we have? What's the first question?
All right, gentlemen. So this has been very insightful and interesting to listen to you. And on the same lines, we've got a few questions that have come in, and I'd like to start with the first one, which is, I constantly see waiters in hotels and restaurants get insulted by unruly and unreasonable customers, right? Their supervisors never come to their aid or defend them, even if it's clear that the customer is wrong. So we just want your take on this as to how should we respond to this, or what kind of advice would you give people who are spectators to this kind of thing, or even the victim of this kind of thing?
Well, do you mind if I respond to it? Just
yeah,
this is for the entire panel.
Yeah, I suppose this you probably may not. I don't know. This is maybe a bit controversial. My response to this. I started my career. I actually started my career washing up, but rapidly moved into waiting table. So I think there's a couple of really important things here. And I then latterly, a few years ago now, we owned a restaurant. My wife and I owned a restaurant. My wife is Italian, has Italian origins. She's not very good at the being spoken to with that respect. So my wife will respond very quickly to that. Let's put it that way.
Well, you've survived a fairly long time, huh? You've done all right.
Precisely, Gary. Yeah. So so she doesn't. But for me, it was always about if I was the waiter. I'm not agree. I think the behaviour is completely abhorrent again. But for me, it was about I'm taking money from them. So that individual. I'm not saying that we should be allowing that behaviour, but there's always what does the customer need from us? It's just going to push a lot of buttons for me to basically be, particularly in a relationship where the customer is giving me money, not to accept that kind of behaviour. I don't know. Maybe my views are going to shock people. At the end of the day, I have to say that the customer is always right. The customer is always going to, if it's paying me money. I've worked with general managers who have basically, gone to hotel guest bedrooms and actually packed their luggage and removed them from the hotel from the way they've been speaking to people.
Wow.
I think you're right. I think you're right to feel that way. I think my response to the question is going to be, it depends on whether you're the person on the receiving end of that treatment or the observer, and how you behave will be colored by which position you're in. To Andrew's point, if you're a waiter in a restaurant and someone's abusive, I mean, it's really hard for you to do anything about it, right? Because you might lose your job. You might be thinking, actually, was it my fault? You are taking money from that person. Whereas if you're sitting at the same table as another person who's, you think, being abusive towards a person who's doing a perfectly good job of work, then you can choose again whether you have a moral obligation to step in and say, mate, tone it down a bit, right? But you are in a better position and able to make a difference if you choose to. The poor guy who's waiting at table may not be able to have that choice, right? So there should be no pressure on him to sort of go, I'm going to dash my stuff down and walk out the door, because that could be the only job he has or she has, and they might have a family to feed.
Yeah.
So it depends on where you're looking at it from.
Just to add to you guys.
Can I just we have a Sri Lankan I'm going to sound very privileged now, so please forgive me. But we have a Sri Lankan lifeguard who looks after our swimming pool, does an amazing job. And we've just literally yesterday, swimming pools in Abu Dhabi were open for the first time. So it's a private gated community we live in.
Right.
But the pools have been closed. And yesterday, there's quite a lot of limits now. And we had a lady actually from Australia who came down. We're only allowed like 17 people in the pool. So the lifeguards are obviously very, very careful around that, and there's lots of sanitization and before you go into the pool, and temperature checks and recording who's in doing what. But this lady from Australia was very
filled with alcohol, man.
Yeah, and this lady was very aggressive because she was the 18th or 19th person. So of course her family arrived and there were 17 people in the pool, correct, and the lifeguard sort of challenged her and said, you can't, you won't be able to use the pool until someone else leaves the pool. She just attacked this Sri Lankan lifeguard yesterday. I was sitting in the pool going, look, I'll get out of the pool. Do you know what I mean? He's just doing his job, because he was saying, I'm going to get fired, man. I'm going to get fired if I don't stop you from doing this, I'm going to get fired. She was getting very aggressive towards him and racially stereotyping him and that kind of stuff. And I was like going, guys, I'll get my family out of the pool, because we don't need to. We've been here now for an hour or so. We don't need to be in the pool. But I'm just thinking to myself now, reflecting on this conversation, was it right that I was basically, encouraging that behaviour? Because her behaviour was terrible. Should we have been basically saying, sorry, love, the rules are rules. There's rules here to protect everybody. You need to back off. Should I have then gone, trying to protect him, but in a very subservient way, saying, I'll get out of the pool with my family so that you can bring your family in? I'd love to know what your views are on that, guys.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say what I might have done in the circumstances, right? I have an evil sense of humor. Maybe I'd have stood up and asked for volunteers about who came in first to leave first, because this lady seemed desperate to get in the goddamn pool. That's just me. But this is the point. We each make a personal choice, right? Yeah. So it's a very subjective question.
So coming back to the waiter situation, gentlemen, do you think the supervisor needs to step in and defend the waiter's rights, or what do you think of the manager or the supervisor, his role in this?
Frankly, can I be very honest?
Yes, of course.
I actually think it's a really ridiculous question, because there's so much out there that you need to examine, right? Under what circumstances is the individual being rude? So when I listened to Andrew, he provided me with context, right? Yeah. There was a person, she's the 19th person to come in. Yeah, I get that, right? So what causes that behavior? If you're saying you're observing a person who's habitually nasty to the staff, then you're implying that you know that individual, right? Whether the manager comes in and steps in also depends on the values of the organization that restaurant is part of, right? There's so many things at play here. So I think it's a huge generalization to just jump in and take a position on just that. I think we need to explore, right, the various circumstances under which such things can happen. The person being rude to the waiter might be the parent of a very angry, upset, 3-month-old toddler whose nappy hasn't been changed. What are the circumstances? I don't condone that behavior at all. If it is, malicious, if there's no context around that might be a trigger. Even if there is a trigger, I think people should be respectful of other people around them, right? But if that waiter has just spilled a pot of hot soup over my child, I'm probably going to get a little upset about that.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I said I would be very reluctant to give a decision on that, because it has to be on, it's case by case, right? I mean, I would go back to my earlier point. If I was owning the restaurant or managing the restaurant, there's just no way. I mean, we would just encourage the, it's about stimulus response, isn't it? I mean, I would be encouraging the waiter just to brush it off, not take it personally, and just get this person out of the restaurant as quickly as we can in the most polite way. Make sure they're looked after. That would be my advice, but it's case by case, right?
Sure. Steve, real quick, what are your thoughts on that before we move on to our next question?
I'll say two things. I don't think respect is too much to ask in any context from anyone. That's point number one. Point number two would be What we let go, we sanction. So there are UGRs that are created from inaction. And certainly if the supervisor is doing nothing in this instance, then there is a UGR that is created that says, they don't care about me if I'm the waiter. So
that's the value, right? The values of the organization.
At the very least, that supervisor should be supporting their people as much as they possibly can.
Let me actually give you an example of this that you guys will hopefully relate to. I think you will all remember the controversy that led to the stepping down of Travis Kalanick as CEO of Uber. Yeah.
Right.
And you might recall the press that went into how that organizational culture or the values therein, defined behavior that was raked across the coals. You might also ask yourselves about what's been going on in a number of countries where the way Uber employs drivers is seen through different lenses, right? Whether they're paid a minimum wage, whether they have benefits or not, and so on, right? So the point I'm making here, Steve, is that that's a set of values that come from the top down in an organization that send a distinct message that, to Andrew's point, the customer is always right. If you're sitting in the back of that Uber, you have the right to rate that person a 1-star if you didn't like the aftershave that he or she was wearing, right? And in a value set like that, the customer is always right, and no matter what abuse they give that poor driver is going to get a 1 rating unless they suck it all up from the CEO down. That's the value chain that's been set up, right? So in what culture, or in what value set is this case happening? And to your point, I wouldn't want to work in that sort of organization, but would I have the privilege to decide that? Is that the only job I would have? Like if I was sitting at a table and someone behaved like that, I would have a word with them. Yeah. If their kid was causing that kerfuffle and they needed a bit of time, I'd even offer to go and change that kid's diaper myself just to take the tension out of it a bit.
Oh, that's a good.
I might return the diaper to the parent in question.
Sure. And speaking of Uber, we do have a question on that. We have an audience question on Uber. This is a bit of an interesting one, and I'm very, very curious to know your thoughts on it. Shane?
So the question that we got on Uber was, I wanted to drive for Uber to earn some extra income. I have a full-time job and I'm financially stable, but I wanted to do this to increase my savings. My family members were dead against it. My in-laws even more so. How can I convince them that this is a dignified job and that there is no shame in doing so?
Why do you need to convince them? This is your decision to make, and if you believe you have the self-respect, right, to make that decision, why do you need to convince anyone else? Right? I mean, ask yourself, right, if your in-laws feel that driving an Uber car is to make ends meet or make a second income, generate food on the table for your family, maybe they don't get that, right? I mean, I take a very hard line on that, and I don't think anybody else has the right to judge, right? As long as I'm doing something perfectly legal, I could be sweeping the roads. Maybe I enjoy that. Hey, it gets me out in the fresh air, for heaven's sakes, right? So that's me, guys. Over to you.
Yeah, no, Larry, I'm completely with you. I think you're right. As long as it's not illegal, I think you're doing what you want to do to support your family. I think that's the greatest accolade, really. If you want to earn extra money because you want to support and provide a better future for your family, it's got no one else should have a view on that. I mean, I think if you are doing something illegal, then I think they would perhaps have they'd be looking after your best interests. But no, I completely agree with Larry.
Yeah, but is it easier said than done though? Because from a personal standpoint, I can give you a quick example. When I studied in the States, I had to do whatever job that I got to earn a few bucks on the side, and I waited tables. Now I know that none of my friends in Sri Lanka ever would even think about, or rather my parents would never even think about me doing a part-time job, waiting tables or anything like that. But the perspective by me doing that, or the perspective that I received, was life-changing. I mean, it changed. It completely shifted my mindset. It changed the way I look at the service industry, the way I look at every single job, and regardless of whether it's CEO or the janitorial stuff. I found a profound respect, for the service industry and for all jobs. Now, at the same time, I've taught students. I've tried to encourage them to pick up a job on the side and work while they're in school. And that culture isn't here. I mean, they would happily intern in an organization, but they would never wait tables. They would never flip a burger, at a McDonald's or whatever. And so
they need a good crisis. I would put it to you that some of these friends of yours need a bloody good crisis, right, to wake up. In your case, mate, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's bloody hard for you to get new parents, but I bet you have new friends.
Right. No, absolutely, and so that's why I wanted to bring this up because I literally had these kids tell me that their parents asked, how much do you get working here? Okay, if it's let's say 15,000, that's less than $100. They'll be okay. I'll pay you double. Just stay at home and study. And when you have that kind of an environment, so the question I'm asking is, could that has to have some sort of an effect on you, right? Like moving forward, and then when you're in the workplace, do you think those things carry through and they affect?
Yeah, that's the conditioning I was talking about. Right?
Oh yeah, conditioning.
That's the conditioning I was talking about, right? And the person you are today, however long on from that decision set that you made, is I think a testament to the fact that you might have broken out of that conditioning, right? If you choose to inflict those same values on your children, then you're passing on that conditioning, and you've never really changed that, right? So, but what I'm hearing here is you took on a completely different worldview because of the experiences that you had, and good on you for that.
Yeah.
And your original question then, Varun, your original question when you started to explain this was, is this easier said than done? So there's one answer to that, and that is, yes, it is much easier said than done. It's to my immense regret that I've never been to Sri Lanka. I really regret saying that. I would have loved to have been to your country and would still like to go in the future. Yeah. So I've been a bit reluctant to speak up now, but from hearing you guys speak now, it seems to me that there are UGRs in Sri Lanka to do with job status.
Oh yeah.
And job status, race, caste, creed, mate, it's all there, but it's not unique to Sri Lanka. It's in a number of other societies as well, but it is around the one that we grew up in. Sorry, Steve, do go on. I'll shut up.
No. Because you come from a very informed point of view, Larry. I mean, quite seriously, I've really been fascinated to hear your thoughts. But the first step in breaking through a UGR is being aware of it. That's the first step. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's the first step. And you have become aware of that, Varun, and right. That's to your benefit, being aware of it.
Okay, and then all right, understood. All right.
Well, we've worked with companies to both understand and improve their UGRs, but we've not done it for any countries. So maybe Sri Lanka could be our first country to understand and improve the UGRs. There you go.
Oh, absolutely.
That was a joke, my friend, right? That was a joke.
Yeah. All right, so I think we had time for one more question, and this was interesting. Well, we had a lot, and we picked the best three to ask the panel. So Shane,
yeah. So the question goes as, my boss always gets me to do all his personal work. For example, he asks me to do his children's homework, like printouts, that kind of thing. Help his wife with her business social media pages, deliver things, etc. Right? All my friends laugh at me. I'm in a managerial role in this company. My subordinates don't respect me. What do? I feel like resigning.
So resign. If you have the luxury of being able to resign.
Larry's on a roll to.
If you don't have the luxury of resigning because it's the only bloody job you've got, then think about it, right? Maybe the thing is to bring it up with your boss and kind of explain to this person how you feel, although you do run the risk of being, banged around the head a bit, right? But if you really feel like you want to resign because you feel that you're not being given the respect you deserve, then you've got an image in your head, right, of the self-respect that you have for yourself. Do something about it.
I would say if you're getting paid and you're not happy with it, I would say develop an exit strategy, but definitely don't act rashly. I would say continue doing what you're doing and then spend a little bit of time seeking, working out an exit strategy. That stuff kind of goes on everywhere, though. I mean, I don't think it's unique to you.
Yeah.
And it depends on who the boss is. I mean, is the boss the person paying you, or is the boss the do they work for a big corporate company and they're kind of using you? There's so many. I'd like a lot wider context around what's actually happening there.
So I guess it changes.
But implicit in this context is the fact that the boss sees that that's the only value you can bring. Okay. So if you want to raise this with a boss, then maybe you need to create the business case for you doing things other than attending to his family matters. Right. So what extra value could you bring if you were pushed to be able to push some of this to one side, not all of it, because that won't be tolerated, but some of this to one side and bring your other skills and expertise to bear? What value could you bring?
Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, like Andrew said, I mean, this is something that happens around the world, and we see this a lot in Sri Lanka as well. We see sometimes that lines being crossed. Interesting point to have an exit strategy. Maybe that is a thing. But in the workplace, is there anything that can be done to avoid this? I mean, does it have to start at the top, or could HR do anything?
Many organizations, particularly the big global ones, actually have active policies that do discourage this. Not discourage this, that actually ban it.
Ban it, okay.
But does that actually stop it from happening? No. I don't think it does. I think Andrew's absolutely right. It does happen. And whether it's a boss asking a secretary to make a restaurant booking for him to take his wife out to dinner on their anniversary, or it's what the person asking the question as an example is, it's still that personal piece, right? It's where do you draw the line? And as an individual, if you find that is offensive, if you find that that's not the right thing that you want to be doing, you can make a plan to do something about it, whether you do something immediately or have an exit strategy, take a very measured approach, or put up with it. It's like being in an abusive relationship, right? You can choose to, or maybe you don't have the choice until you have an exit strategy, right? But the point I'm always making is you've got to have that position yourself about what makes you happy and what you're prepared to do about that.
Yeah, so I haven't. Go ahead, Andrew, and I'll ask.
I've worked in the HR space for more than 30 years, and I swear to you now, there's loads of things like whistleblowing and grievances. I've worked in dozens of massive organisations. If you go down the route of a grievance, you're effectively your career's kind of over. In my that's just being honest, guys. Being very, very honest. If you go and do that to doesn't matter what happens, you go down that route and you raise a formal grievance, you've got to at least, I would say, exactly to Larry and Steve's points, challenge the person who's doing that to you, and suggest that maybe there's better uses of your time. But again, if that boss actually owns the organisation, they probably hired you to do that anyway. So again, I would go back to more context.
Can I actually, another thought just occurred to me, right? Just a slightly different perspective. Maybe the boss in this particular instance means no ill, right? Maybe that person actually trusts you to do this piece of work and is opening himself or herself up to you at a deeply personal level that he would never do with someone else. It's a possibility, right? Again, if you don't like that and you feel that you're being demeaned somehow, then you have the right to bring that up. And if it's a boss in that scenario, then that individual, man or woman, would like to listen, right? So, I'm so sorry. I never meant it to be that way, right? But I would never trust anybody else to have the phone number of my wife.
Exactly.
You gentlemen accept it, of course. Right?
So,
happy to share.
Let me throw in an interesting wrench into this conversation, and from a UGR point of view, certain industries, it's almost like it's accepted, right? The first thing that comes to my mind is it's the Devil's with Prada, the whole Meryl Streep, abusing Anne Hathaway's character. And we've come to know like the fashion industry may have that, the entertainment industry, especially because it's so hard to get in, that you're willing to do whatever it takes to get in. So those are work environments as well. So maybe Steve, do you have an explanation for that, or is there a it's almost like it's a given. You got to eat dirt, you got to pay your dues, or you're not getting in. And then what do you do in that sense?
I was working with a major automotive company. You would all know this company. It's an international brand that you would know. It's a major company.
Sure.
And I was working with the leadership teams from car dealerships, multiple dealerships in the room, and we were exploring the UGRs in their dealerships. And one of the things that we unearthed, and I learned later that this is very typical in the automotive industry, is that within dealerships, I don't know if you guys know this, but within dealerships, the sales department hate the service department, and the service department hates the parts department, and they're all at war with each other, right? They all don't get on. And when we unearthed this through our work with UGRs, one of the dealer principals, one of the owners of one of these dealerships said to me, Steve, what you've got to understand is that it's always been like this. So I remember his name was Michael. I said, so Michael, there's a rule book, is there? There's a rule book that says it's got to be this way. And even if there was a rule book, is this in the interests of your business, right? Is this hurting your business? Because if it is, you know what? You can throw out that rule book and do something about it. So my point here is that too often there are traditions that are accepted within organisations and never ever challenged. But the fundamental question should be, is this hurting our business? Because if it is, you know what? We can do something about it. And that is so seldom addressed. It's incredible.
All right, that's an interesting insight. So I'm afraid we're almost out of time. So I would like to ask one last question from each of you gentlemen. What would the one tip be if you want organizations or senior managers, or rather the stakeholders, to embrace or to become conscious of the need for dignity at work? What can they do to either recognize or either to fix what's the respective organizations? What can they do? The one tip that you would ask them to embrace dignity at work and to implement if it's not there.
I think it's what Andrew said earlier on, right? If I can jump in, it's treat others as you want them to treat you. Fundamentally, I think that's it. Right? And it doesn't matter whether you're the chief executive of the organization or the janitor. Right? It's what makes us human and connects us.
Yeah, and then you reap the rewards of that. I mean, I genuinely, I'm a huge believer in karma, and it's, treat others as you want to be treated, and then you just. I mean, I suppose it's a bit like I often tell a story about a human cash machine. If I go to the cash machine every day, or the ATM, I'm not sure what you guys call it, but I call it a cash machine because I'm a POM. But if I go to the cash machine, I take out money every single day. There's going to be a point where my bank's going to kind of say, actually, time out. You haven't got sufficient funds here. But right. If you make regular deposits with your team members, and by those regular deposits, I mean treat them with respect, treat them as you'd like to be treated, actually you can almost make unlimited withdrawals from your team member. So it's a very, very simple equation for me. Treat people like you want to be, treat them as you want to be. You're a banker, Larry, so you'd appreciate this. People will loan me loads and loads of money as long as I'm paying money back. It's as simple as that, and that will go on forever. The moment I stop paying back, then of course my relationships are destroyed. So yeah, and I don't mean it in a nasty way, but just treating people with respect, lots and lots of regular deposits, and those regular deposits, it's smiling, it's eye contact, it's saying good morning, good afternoon, how are your kids, happy Eid, whatever it might be. They owe your deposits. You do those things, they will get paid back to you tenfold.
Yep, I guess at some point Bernie Madoff stopped smiling.
Yeah.
Steve, your tip to organizations?
It's a hard question. Just one tip. It's a very hard question. I would say understand that every person who comes to work, irrespective of how much money they get paid, and despite the face they bring to work, is actually a human being. with their own personal struggles, challenges, joys, difficulties, and yet they bring their work face to work. They are actually people, and I don't think we should ever lose sight of that, ever.
Nicely put, Steve. All right, with that said, I'm afraid we're out of time and we come to a close of today's conversation on dignity at work. Will it ever arrive here? So big thank you to our guests, Larry, Andrew, and Steve. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a pleasure having you guys on this show. Do stay back for a few minutes after our live session has ended, and we'll conclude our debrief. And a special thank you goes out to Shane, my co-host for the day, and thank you very much. Thanks, Shane. And thank you very much. And a big thank you to the Luminary team and the audience who tuned in today. Thank you for sending us your questions prior to the show today. We really appreciate it. Next week, we'll be speaking to international speaker and best-selling author Paul McGee, and we'll be speaking to management consultant and career coach Corina Naju. And then we'll be speaking to the head of group Human Resources, Legal and Corporate Communications at the Haley's Group, Darshi Talpahewa, and we'll be talking about what does it truly take to get promoted. So don't forget to tune in next week. I'm Varun Chandramohan. Thank you for joining us today. See you next Saturday.
Cheers, man.